There was a little pocket of the 1960s when the world had not yet quite decided what it was becoming. The music had not fully gone wild. The colors had not yet begun shouting. Men still wore hats because civilization still believed in hats. Women wore gloves, sensible shoes, and expressions severe enough to frighten weak men back into banking. And in certain respectable circles, especially the British ones, style, class, and brilliant criminology were still considered one and the same profession. It was during that fleeting season of polished shoes and polished lies that America was visited by the most celebrated detective ever to arrive on its shores with a monocle, a hereditary title, and a travel valise full of Turkish cigarettes. His full name, as embossed upon the invitation cards in lettering grand enough to require a second sheet, was the Most Honourable Sir Marmaduke Reginald Algernon, Throckmorton, Fitzwilliam Cholmondeley, B.T., KCMG, OBE, J.P., of Throckmorton Hall, Piffle-on-the-Mire, Detective Extraordinary to the Gentry. He preferred, however, to be called Marmy. He had solved his first case, he often remarked, while still wearing a sailor suit at Eton. He arrived in America by transatlantic steamer, bringing along a vintage Rolls-Royce with silver trim, polished luggage, and a long-suffering valet, secretary, driver, dresser, and occasional murder suspect known simply as Baines. Baines drove in silence. Marmy sat in the back seat, polishing his monocle and muttering about the lower orders. The city that received him was the sort of American city that called itself modern, because it had one new hotel, 4 television sets in City Hall, and a mayor who used the phrase civic destiny more often than any man with his own hair ought to. That mayor was scheduled, on the morning in question, to present Sir Marmaduke with the key to the city. This was, naturally, a real thing. The ceremony was held on the steps of City Hall under a sky the color of weak dishwater. Reporters shuffled about, flashbulbs popped, a municipal band played something patriotic with all the urgency of a threatened lunch break. The mayor, Horace Bixley, beamed beside a velvet cushion on which lay an enormous ceremonial key, silver-plated and useless, except as a symbol, which was precisely why everyone seemed so proud of it. Marmy stood at the podium in a pale suit with a carnation in his lapel and accepted the applause as one accepts tribute from a conquered province. America, he said into the microphone, has always interested me. Such vitality, such violence, such very broad neckties. The crowd laughed politely. The mayor stepped forward with the key. And then, without warning, a brick flew out of nowhere and struck him on the side of the head with a sound like somebody dropping a ham in a church. The mayor went down. Women screamed. Men shouted. The municipal band stopped in mid-note. The giant ceremonial key slipped from the cushion and landed on the steps with a metallic clatter that sounded oddly final. For one wild instant nobody moved. Then Baines muttered, "Good Lord!" and the police began running in circles with great authority. The mayor was rushed to the hospital, where a grave physician emerged an hour later and announced that he was alive, but only just. "He is in a coma," said the physician. "A regular coma?" asked the police chief. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. "No, a television coma," he said sarcastically. "He may awaken at any time to point weakly at his attacker, or he may lie there for several episodes." The room took that in. It was agreed by all concerned that the matter was grave. Unless the mayor woke and fingered his assailant, the crime might never be solved. But Sir Marmaduke Reginald Algernon Throckmorton Fitzwilliam Cholmondeley refused to be underestimated. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, he had commandeered the mayor's private reception room in City Hall, and assembled a room full of suspects, witnesses, bystanders, and at least one man who had merely come to repair the radiator and had been too polite to leave. The policeman assigned to the case, Lieutenant Joe Malloy, stood near the door with a notebook in his hand and the uncertain expression of a man who had entered the wrong classroom and was trying to learn from the experience. In the room were Miss Constance Wren, the mayor's executive secretary, a severe woman with steel spectacles, an iron bun, and a posture suggesting that laughter had once insulted her family, Mr. Teddy Vale, local television announcer and master of ceremonies for the event, a glossy man with a fine smile and a suspiciously perfect wave to his hair, Mrs. Beatrice Crum, president of the Civic Betterment League, donor of the ceremonial velvet cushion, and owner of a brickworks on the north side of town, Dr. Lionel Pruitt, the physician who had diagnosed the mayor's television coma, Mr. Silas Keyes, municipal locksmith and maker of the ceremonial key, Mrs. Evelyn Bixley, the mayor's sister, who wore black despite the fact that her brother was not technically dead, Baines, who had driven Marmy to the ceremony and now stood against the wall looking like a man considering prison as a form of retirement, and Lieutenant Malloy, who still had no earthly idea why he had been told to remain in the room, but had remained nonetheless because British people can sound official merely by standing upright. Marmy lit a cigarette, narrowed his eyes, and addressed them. "Ladies, gentlemen, policemen, one of you attempted to murder the mayor this morning with a brick. Fortunately, such things are child's play." No one spoke. Marmy began pacing. "The case at first seemed simple," he said, "which is why, naturally, it is not. A brick is never merely a brick, a mayor is never merely a mayor, and a key, particularly a key to a city, is almost never only symbolic." Lieutenant Malloy looked down at his notebook and wrote the words. "Not sure." Marmee whirled and pointed at Mrs. Crumb. You, madam, own a brickworks, obviously suspicious. Mrs. Crumb blinked. I donate half the bricks used in public buildings. Exactly. Generosity is often camouflage. He turned instantly toward Miss Wren. And you, Miss Wren, type the invitations. With disappearing ink. Marmee switched his monocle to the other eye, as if that made him seem more serious. The seating cards for luncheon have faded. Miss Wren reply, that's because the caterer spilled club soda on them. Or because, said Marmee, raising one finger, someone wished to conceal a last-minute alteration in the guest list. Malloy wrote in his notebook, Club soda. Marmee pivoted toward Teddy Vale. You, he said, have the smile of a man who has lied to many cameras. I'm on television, said Teddy. Just so, and television, in my experience, is organized deceit. Teddy drew himself up. I was introducing the mayor when he was hit. Yes. And doing so from the left side of the podium, where any number of visual cues could have signaled an accomplice hidden in the clock tower, or the shrubbery, or indeed, disguised as a member of the municipal band. We don't have a clock tower, said Lieutenant Malloy quietly. In England there would have been a magnificent object, too magnificent, which means it hides something. It doesn't hide anything. To everyone's surprise, a tiny compartment popped open in the shaft of the key. There was a collective intake of breath. Inside was a folded scrap of paper. Well, I'll be... Marmee unfolded the note. It was blank. Disappearing ink. Mr. Keyes frowned. That's the warranty card. A likely story. The room stared. Marmee began again. The mayor was struck at the precise moment he extended the key. Why? Because the key itself mattered. It was either a murder weapon, a clue, a hidden document, a code, or all four. It's a key to the city. Yes, and what is a city, Lieutenant, but an enormous locked room? There was a silence so complete it deserved formal recognition. Marmee marched on. Now then, one of you is concealing an identity. One of you is not what you appear to be. One of you is related by blood to another person in this room. One of you is blind. One of you has already escaped justice once through a form of double jeopardy so brazen that I applaud it on artistic grounds alone. And one of you, perhaps more than one of you, is a twin. Miss Wren stared at him. A twin? Yes. Mrs. Evelyn Bixley raised a hand. I do have a twin sister in Duluth. Marmee froze. You see, he cried, the whole room is beginning to sing. Duluth, said Evelyn, is in Minnesota. Crime respects no borders. He advanced upon Dr. Pruitt. And you, Doctor, you placed the mayor in a television coma. Convenient. It's just a coma, said the doctor. I was making conversation for the reporters. Ah, said Marmee, so you admit fabrication. I admit bedside manner. Marmee took another drag and pointed suddenly at Teddy Vale. You wear pomade. Teddy touched his hair defensively. Of course I wear pomade. But do you wear guilt? Teddy opened his mouth and closed it again. Marmee spun on Baines. And you, my own Baines, where were you at the moment of impact? At the motor car, said Baines. Too obvious, therefore suspicious. For 22 years, said Baines flatly, everything I do has apparently been both too obvious and suspicious. Excellent, said Marmee. Bitterness, always promising. Lieutenant Malloy raised a tentative hand. Sir Marmaduke, maybe we should focus on who actually threw the brick. Marmee looked at him with pity. My dear Lieutenant, if one begins with the brick, one ends with masonry. If one begins with the soul, one may yet arrive at truth. Malloy lowered his hand. Marmee then launched into a magnificent and utterly relentless sequence of theories. He proposed that the mayor had been blackmailing the members of the Civic Betterment League with photographs stolen from a church picnic. He suggested that the key contained not a warranty card, but a second will, altered at the last minute in disappearing ink. He deduced that Teddy Vale's American accent was false and that he had once lived in Sheffield under another name. Teddy admitted after a pause that he had indeed spent 6 months in Sheffield while touring with a dance band. Mrs. Crumb gasped. Marmee took this as confirmation of everything. He announced that Miss Wren's bun concealed the mind of a criminal strategist and that her devotion to office order masked the soul of a Borgia with shorthand. Miss Wren made a note to complain to someone later. He informed Dr. Pruitt that he had the hands of a poisoner. Dr. Pruitt replied that he was an orthopedist. He declared that Mr. Keyes, by virtue of his surname alone, could not be trusted around symbolic metal objects. He theorized that the mayor's sister's twin from Duluth might have crossed state lines for revenge, inheritance, or municipal reasons. And then, in a tone of deep satisfaction, he declared that someone in the room was pretending to be blind. No one responded. Marmee slowly turned and fixed his gaze upon Mrs. Crumb. She stared back. I'm not blind. Then perhaps, said Marmee, swiveling toward Teddy, you are. I host the weather. Exactly. No honest man can describe cloud patterns that cheerfully. At this point, Lieutenant Malloy had stopped writing altogether. The room had entered that special hour of the evening when reality, if not carefully supervised, begins to drift. Marmee checked his watch. It is time, he said, for the oldest device in the detective's art. I shall turn off the lights. Deprived of sight, the guilty conscience becomes unbearable. The murderer, pressed by darkness, will reveal himself. Lieutenant Malloy frowned. Why would he do that? Because, said Marmee, that is what murderers do. Before anyone could object, he crossed to the switch and plunged the room into darkness. There was a beat of perfect black silence. Then, precisely on cue, a woman screamed. Something heavy crashed into something wooden. A man shouted, "My ankle!" Another voice cried, "Who touched me?" Then came a tremendous thud. Marmee's voice rang out in the darkness like a vicar at judgment. Aha! The lights came back on. Mr. Teddy Vale was sprawled on the floor beside a toppled fern, one shoe missing, his forehead bumped, his dignity greatly reduced. Lieutenant Malloy hurried to him. What happened? Teddy groaned. I tripped over that blasted plant. Marmee leaned down and studied him. Or were tripped, he said softly. I was not murdered by a fern, snapped Teddy. Not murdered, said Marmee, merely edited. He resumed pacing, more energized than ever, as if the scream in the dark had restored him at a cellular level. Observe, he cried. The scream, the fall, the confusion, classic diversionary tactics, which means the killer feared I was close. You've accused every person in this room, said Miss Wren. Not every person, said Marmee. All eyes turned, slowly with the unbearable relish of a man unwrapping his own genius for an audience, lifted a finger and pointed at In no fois Hantura. Baines shut his eyes. Good God, whispered Lieutenant Joe Malloy, it's the butler. He is not a butler, snapped Baines. He is many things, said Sir Marmaduke Reginald Algernon Throckmorton Fitzwilliam Cholmondeley, but above all, he is a man driven beyond endurance. The room went still. Marmee stepped closer, voice low and solemn now. You have borne years of monologues, digressions, deductions, class commentary, tobacco ash, monocle polishing, and endless verbal scenery. You have driven me through fog, through rain, through murder, through luncheon. You have stood at my elbow while I explained the obvious, the impossible, and the irrelevant with equal confidence. And this morning, as the mayor prepared to hand me yet another ceremonial object and launch me into yet another public speech, something in you broke. Baines began pulling at his own hair. Oh, shut up, he said. Marmee raised one eyebrow. Baines's face contorted. Shut up, he said louder. Lieutenant Joe Malloy took a step forward. Shut up, shut up, shut up, shut up. He clapped his hands over his ears and shouted at the ceiling. All you do is talk, talk and talk and talk and talk. Turnabout is fair play, child's play, the soul of the matter. What does any of that even mean? You don't know anything. You've never solved a crime in your life. The room recoiled in fascination. I killed the mayor. Or tried to. I was aiming at you. I couldn't bear one more luncheon, one more monocle, one more theory about bloodstains or butlers or blasted twins. I saw the brick on the ledge and I threw it. I threw it because I would rather swing for murder than listen to another 15 minutes of your voice. There was a stunned silence. At last, Teddy Vale, still on the floor, looked up and said weakly, But he solved all those mysteries. No, he didn't. He just talked and talked and talked, and by sheer blind coincidence and luck, the killer was usually some poor devil who'd been trapped in a room with him for more than 10 minutes and couldn't bear the thought of living one more damn minute in the same world. A thoughtful pause followed this. Then Miss Wren adjusted her spectacles. So, she said carefully, he actually did solve them. He just didn't know how. Marmee considered this with immense dignity. Elementary, he said. Lieutenant Malloy stared at him, then at Baines, then back at him again. Marmee drew himself up to full height and gave the order with imperial calm. Constable, he said, though Malloy was not technically a constable, take him away and put him in irons. Malloy, too exhausted to argue across cultures, took Baines by the arm. As Baines was being led from the room, Teddy Vale, still nursing his head, called out, But what about me? What about the scream in the dark? Baines turned back wild-eyed. I don't know! You tripped over the fern, you idiot! He was hauled away down the corridor, still muttering obscenities about monocles. Marmee picked up the ceremonial key, snapped shut its tiny compartment, and handed it to Lieutenant Malloy. A pleasing little matter, he said, though I must say, American bricks lack subtlety. Later that evening, the mayor briefly opened one eye, asked why his sister was dressed for a funeral, and fell back asleep. The newspapers called it a brilliant piece of detective work. The city council voted to present Sir Marmaduke with the key to the city as soon as the mayor was well enough to survive another ceremony. Baines was charged, tried, and sentenced with admirable efficiency. And somewhere in the deep and private chambers of his heart, Lieutenant Malloy came to understand that genius and nuisance are very often roommates. As for Sir Marmaduke Reginald Algernon Throckmorton Fitzwilliam Cholmondeley, 9th Baronet of Upper Piffle-on-the-Mire, he returned overseas convinced he had once again triumphed by reason alone, which, in its way, was true. Because in a world governed by coincidence, vanity, ceremonial keys, and men who simply will not stop talking, reason sometimes takes very strange forms. And so the case was closed. The mayor lived, the brick was catalogued, the fern was righted. And another crime was solved with the utmost seriousness in that peculiar jurisdiction where madness dresses for dinner and absurdity wears a hat, a place some men call the atomic zone,